hosting a podcast or being a guest, it can take or weeks or even months for you to really start to see results, especially if you're starting your own podcast. It could be a year, it could be 2 years before you really start for people to check out your podcast and to take off. And then same thing with being a guest. It could be weeks, it could be months for you to start to see those leads coming in from the shows. So it's going to be a long process, and just having those expectations from the beginning where you're not going out there and running like a Facebook ad or a Google ad. It's going to be a little bit more drawn out. It's going to take a little bit longer of a time period. So I think just knowing that going in and knowing that, okay, it's going to take time for me to build this podcast up, and I shouldn't expect overnight success with it, where, yeah, if you already have that social media following, maybe, but for most of us out there starting our show or being a guest, it's going to take some time to really see those good results.
Trevor, welcome to the Point of Impact.
Thanks, Aaron. Super excited to be here and hopefully provide some value to your audience.
Well, I'll tell you what, I was pleased to have discovered you and your podcasts, multiple, and I'm really intrigued to find out more about the services you provide with Podcasting You. But one of the things I'm really interested in is, how you fell into this niche of guest appearing for, I guess, specifically real estate investors.
Yeah, most certainly. So I guess to really take you back in time to really start from the beginning, I think it's a good starting spot. So back in 2015, I was running a separate company that I run now, not Podcasting You. And it was through that company that I was running my own podcast, and I was doing everything. I was booking guests for the show. I was creating recaps of the episodes. I was doing the social media for the show. So did that for about 2 years and had all those skills that I learned. Long story short, the partnership didn't end up working out with the partner, and took those skills that I had. And honestly, I just started freelancing them out. I signed up for a platform called Upwork, and I was finding freelance gigs of people that wanted to get their podcast edited. They wanted to be a guest on shows. They needed help finding guests for their shows. And I was still in college at the time. So I was just sort of looking at it as like a freelance gig just to make some extra side money while I'm still in school. And then after the first year, I mean, I had quite a number of clients. I didn't have any employees or anything like that. After the first year, started to grow it. And as the podcasting space really started to take off, we found that there was more people looking to go on podcasts, and there's more people looking for help finding guests for their show. And I would say that really took off probably in 2020. And I think it was the pandemic. People are home more. I know podcasting just for some reason really took off. And in 2020, I think that's because more people were at home. So started the company in 2017. Again, started as a side gig, grew it over time. And between 2017 and 2020, I was pretty much working with like any client that we could work with, whether they were in real estate, whether they were a politician, whether they were in the health space. But the challenge with that is every time you work with a new client in a different niche, you have to build new relationships with podcast hosts. So it just took a lot of time. So I was like, okay, why don't we work in one specific niche? Who do we like working with, and what do I have an interest in? And that was always just real estate. And obviously within the real estate space, there's a ton of different niches within it. You have like your multifamily investors and your self-storage investors and your mobile home park investors and your single family people. So, I mean, there's tons of niches within real estate, but that's where we decided to focus on in 2020. And part of it was, one, that I wanted to focus on a singular niche. And then two was sort of like, there's other companies like myself out there. And the question always came up on sales calls was, why should I work with your company over another company? And well, we get you booked on podcasts. We will create like a professional one sheet for you. You have a dedicated booking agent. So it became hard on those conversations because a lot of the times we just fall back to price. Oh, you're more expensive, or you're cheaper. I don't necessarily want to be the cheapest company that's out there. So it just made it a lot easier on the conversations to pick up potential clients just saying, hey, we only specialize in real estate. And if someone came to us and they weren't in real estate, then we would refer them off to one of these other agencies that were out there. And that's sort of how we found our niche and found our groove. And then even the real estate space really started to take off in 2020 as well. And there was a rise of people going out there and buying multifamily apartment buildings and different asset classes. And really back in 2020, interest rates were so low, you could buy a property and almost double your money in 18 months. So many people got into the real estate game. So it was just a good timing for my company to go in that niche. And then within the real estate industry, as a whole. Well, now it's a lot different. It'd be very hard to double your money on a property within 18 months or 24 months now, but it was a lot easier in 2020. So I think it just gravitated a lot more people to the space, and it just happened to be that was our niche that we are focusing on.
It's interesting because I started becoming a podcast guest right around that same time. This more for my speaking events, booking speaking events and marketing myself that way. But I hired a podcast placement company, and I think I started with it was like $500, and mostly what I got out of it was a podcast, a bio. They typed up a PDF bio for me and promised me 2 shows, I think, a month. And I thought, man, I could do this on my own. So um, I think it was much less specific, right? Uh, what kind of shows would you like to be on? And by the time I'd done the homework just for them, I probably could have just reached out.
Mm.
So I think uh, specializing seems to be, it's one of those things where, like, what do they say? If you're talking to everybody, you're talking to no one. But I started a podcast now. This has been a little over a year. I think maybe it's FOMO. I didn't want to be the only one that didn't have a podcast. But you're right. Just a few years ago, the this environment, this marketing space, was really just starting to take off, and it seems like you recognize that, and you found your niche, and then you're helping others connect to podcasts for their marketing. But one of the other services you do, or as part of the service, is helping them to be a great podcast guest. So, what are some of the do's and don'ts about being a podcast guest?
Yeah, most certainly. So I'd say a couple of the biggest things when you're going out there and being a podcast guest is people like to hear stories where they want to learn more about your background. So you're going on the podcast, you're sharing stories. Like previously, I was going through basically the whole story from 2015 to now looking to 2024 and how I started my company. So people can, I find, relate more to stories. And you're going through when you're sharing your stories, you're almost going from point A to point B. So back in 2015, I had no idea about podcasting. Now in 2024, I'm running this podcast agency. So just to give you a specific example, that's what it looks like. So sharing those stories, I would say making sure that you have good quality podcasting equipment, whether that's having good lighting, whether that's having a good webcam, whether it's having a good podcast mic, just making sure you have all of that. Like right now I use the Blue Yeti mic. That's my preference. There's tons of mics that you can buy out there. I spent probably about $100 on my mic. You can buy mics that are cheaper. You can buy mics that are more expensive, but just making sure that you have a good quality one, that you're not just recording either with like your AirPods in or just not even having a mic and recording on your computer. So that would definitely be a don't. I've tried to do interviews myself, interviewing people, and they've been in their car on their iPhone or whatever phone that they may have, and the quality isn't going to be that good. I've had people try to do it while they're driving, making sure that you're sitting in a nice quiet spot within your house, making sure that there's not that much noise going on. Certain things, like sometimes there might be construction outside my house. Well, I know that's going to be picked up on my mic, so I'm just going to go through and reschedule the interview. Hopefully the next time I book it, maybe it's a week or two out, that's not going to be an issue because the microphones are going to pick up a lot of that background noise. Another aspect would be not being overly promotional on the podcast. I find that some people almost look at it as like an infomercial where you're going on there and you're just spewing your product, you're spewing your service, where there's always going to be a time and place on the podcast where you can talk about, okay, like this is where you can learn more about our company if you are interested in working with us. But I've had guests where interviewing them where they're just like over the top promotional. I'm like, I get it, like you have a good service offering, but like now it's becoming kind of annoying with how much you're promoting it. And I think the audience can see through that. And then I would say the other aspect of being a good quality guest is just getting better at speaking and being more comfortable with it. And this just comes with time. It's not something that you go on your first podcast and you're going to be like, okay, like I'm an excellent guest, or I'm sure Aaron, when you did your first couple of interviews, I'm sure it was a little nerve wracking or a little anxious, and that's just going to come with more practice that you do. And even for myself, running this podcast agency and being on podcasts and hosting my own podcast back starting again in 2015, I still wasn't 100% comfortable going out there and doing it. And it was super uncomfortable in the beginning. And in order to get better, so I signed up for like a Toastmasters club, which is just a public speaking club where you go through and you just practice public speaking. I was still in college at the time, so I had the opportunity to take a public speaking course. And what that really looked like is you would give about a 10 to 15-minute speech about once a month for the 3 or 4 months that we were there. So got more practice doing that. And then obviously the other students that they were giving their speeches as well. So it was just something that I worked on, and just not having that expectation when you're going out there and being a guest that the very first interview that you do as a guest or as a host is going to be perfect. Just continuing to work on it. But again, the big things would be making sure you have a good quality mic as a guest, making sure that you're being concise with, not so much being concise, but sharing stories on your interviews. And then the don'ts would be not having a good quality mic, being overly promotional, showing up late or not showing up on time, or just missing the interview entirely. That's always not a fun experience for the host or the guest as well. Sometimes there might be a mix up here and there depending on the time, but if you just blow it off, and I've had clients that have done that and I end up just stop working with them. I'm like, if you can't show up for your interview, and then there's a lot that goes on the host background for the host to prepare and the guest doesn't show up, that's just not a good look. Again, occasionally it might happen, you just happen to forget about the interview, but you don't want to make it something that goes on all the time. But yeah, those are really the big do's and don'ts as a guest. I think everyone has a short story to share. It's more or less just working on getting that story out of you, and that really only comes with more practice and going out there and doing more interviews.
So rule number one is don't record a podcast while walking on the beach on your phone and talking on your phone. What about, you said you were talking about having a good quality mic, but there's also those, what is it, the pop filter? What is it called? Where there's something to, on the other end of the spectrum, from having a good quality mic to having too much, what is it, mouth sounds coming through. One of the things that drives me crazy when I'm listening to a podcast is lip smacking, or it sounds like somebody's breathing, like they've got the microphone stuck right up their nose. You know what I'm talking about? Is there uh, is there a filter, or is there a way to help filter out that those mouth sounds?
Yeah, I'd say there's two ways. Like you mentioned, having the pop filter, and that's relatively inexpensive. I mean, you can go on Amazon and buy that. You can either put it like directly on your mic. I think a lot of them that you can just clip directly onto your desk where you're recording your interview, and then it'll be basically you put it in front of your mic so that it's blocking like it's almost like as it sounds, a popping filter as you make pop sounds with your mouth. It's kind of hard to describe, but similar to what you were describing, like with your lips smacking and then the breathing there as well. Another aspect would be not putting the mic like so close to your mouth, where you want to keep it anywhere from like, I know like Aaron, both you and I have it like, I don't know, maybe 6 or 8 inches away from our mouth, just something similar like that, where yes, it's close to you, but you're not like literally like right on top of it. And sometimes I think people see like radio shows or people are like right on top of their microphone, where their equipment's probably very expensive that they do. So I try to keep it again about 6 to 8 inches away. And then I have like a little, almost like a little filter or a little, I don't know, I put on top of my Blue Yeti mic where it's like a styrofoam piece, and that just helps block out the sounds as well. And I can't remember if it came with the mic or I had to buy it separately, but there's definitely tools that you can use. And what I would do would be, once you've done your first interview, just go back through and listen to it. And you hear what Aaron had mentioned, where you're hearing the lip smacking or you're hearing the breathing. Okay, I need to move the mic from back a little bit, or I need to move myself back a little bit, or I do need to go out there and invest in the pop filter. And again, the pop filter, it should be relatively inexpensive. It should be like maybe 10, $20 on Amazon. It's really not that bad.
Yeah, I've listened to some people on podcasts. It sounds like they're also eating, like a now and laters or something, Starburst. Just keep the stuff out of your mouth. But uh, okay, so that's more of the equipment and technical stuff. What about the content? It, you've mentioned not just coming with a great story or some education to share with another podcast host and their his or her audience, but also having good questions to ask the host. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I would say the good questions coming from the host or coming from the guest is just doing your due diligence on the background of the guest. I find that sometimes you might find that people don't get asked the same questions too often. So you might listen to an interview with someone and it's just very standard questions. How did you get started? How did you say grow your business, how to what's next? But maybe there's something within that nuance of their story where they have on their LinkedIn something that recently happened, or maybe they have something on their Facebook profile. So it's just finding those unique quality questions that you can ask your guests or you can ask the host, because at the end of the day it's like, okay, what's going to make your podcast different from the other 2 million podcasts that are active today? Is it just going to be standard, or are you going to make it a little bit unique? And that could be the type of guests that you interview. Whether, let's say I'm in the real estate industry, do I only interview real estate guests, or do I interview just successful business owners? Do I interview business owners that only do e-commerce? Whatever the niche may be, you don't have to pick or choose which one. I know when I was first starting off, I didn't have a specific niche. I just was happy to interview anyone that I could interview, and then over time picked the specific one. So when it goes back to that, it's just choosing the questions that you ask carefully. And a lot of the times you're sharing information with the podcast host where you're sharing a one sheet, and a one sheet is almost like a media kit where it goes into like questions the host can ask you, topics. And when you're sending that off to the host, like what makes you unique? Like how can you position yourself where if the host does decide to use these questions, how are they going to be able to use them in a unique way to paint a cool background for yourself? And again, I know I mentioned going over stories and sharing different pieces of content, but it's just doing that background on the guest and maybe trying to dig in a little bit deeper. And then what I like to do as a host is I'll do like just a ton of research on the guest, trying to go into, okay, what type of questions can I ask them that, not that I want to throw them off, but what's a question that maybe they haven't heard too often. And that's what I try to do. And again, sometimes it might be hard if the guest has been on 100+ interviews. It might be a little bit difficult to find unique questions to ask them, but that's really our job as podcast hosts, is to make sure we have a good interview with the guest, try to make it somewhat unique. And again, they might have done 100 interviews, so it's going to be difficult, but trying to find that one golden nugget to ask the guest or to give to the host will be well worth it.
Well, these are definitely good pointers for any podcast host. Uh, Nothing bores me more than a host that first question is, after "How you doing?" is "Tell me your story." Yeah, I try to do my own due diligence on my guests, and it's good when the guest knows the host that they're speaking to in the show, the message that what's the mission behind the show, and how can you contribute to that? How can you add value to that audience? But when you're talking to, instead of lessons to the host, these lessons to the best practices for the guest, what kind of layers can you peel back, or how can you help the host tell your story as a guest? How can you be? What are some of the ways you can really help the host make a great show?
Yeah, so I would say the big thing would be checking out the show before you even go on it and listening to an episode or two of it, so that way that you get a flow for the interview. And the reason I say this is that sometimes, to give you an example, I was on a podcast earlier this week and it was a 15-minute episode, and I can tell it, and I could go on and see that it's going to be a 15-minute episode. So I know that going into the show, when I answer my questions, I probably have to be a little bit more concise than when I'm coming on, say, your show, Aaron, where I know, okay, I can explain my story a little bit longer, where my story is going to be a lot shorter. So that's the way that's going to help out the host. Because if I know, okay, I only have 15 minutes allotted for this interview, then I'm going to change it up a little bit. Maybe I'm going to change up the niche that I'm talking to, whether I'm talking to a general business show or whether I'm talking to a very specific real estate investing show. The terminology that I use is going to be different. So depending on the niche that you're in, depending on the show, that's going to be helpful for the host, because I could go into all the ins and outs of real estate investing and go through all the metrics and the numbers. But if it's not a real estate audience, they're probably not going to know, or they're going to really care that much about it. So just having an understanding of the audience, helping out the host would also be sending them that one sheet where, even if you don't have a one sheet, but sending them over your bio, sending them over your headshot, just making sure those things are ready to go before you hop on, making sure that you show up on time for the interview. Because at the end of the day, like a lot of the times I know like my schedule is, it's typically very busy. And if I have an hour block to do an interview and then the guest shows up 10, 15 minutes late, it's going to be more difficult for me to want to get through the whole interview. I might feel a little rushed, and that's not necessarily what I want to be feeling with the guest. I want to make sure I have the comfortability to have the full time. So as a guest, again, it just goes back to checking out the podcast before, understanding the format, asking the host any questions that you may have. Some people want to know the questions beforehand from the host. Sometimes people don't care. So maybe you just send them anyways to your guest. As a host, like for my podcast, I have like a standard 8 questions that I send to every guest. And then maybe I'll switch it up depending on when I start to do that due diligence on the guest background. But that way they can have some sort of idea to understand what's going to be going on the podcast. And again, sometimes people want the questions, sometimes people could care less about them. It's just very guest dependent. Even for our clients that we work with, some care, some don't care. You never know who's going to care or whatnot. So you just want to make it as easy as possible for both the guest and the host, because you want to have that good podcast episode going on together. And it's not just a two-way street. If the guest comes on and they're not doing a good job, or if the host isn't doing a good job, the audience is going to pick up on that. So you want to make sure that you're each doing a good job. You just want to make each other's jobs basically as easy as possible as it is before you even hit that record button. Okay, like here's potentially what we're going to be talking about. Here are some of the topics. And yeah, you can definitely deviate from them. I know I've had topics set up for a guest, and next thing I know, we hone in on one topic for 45 minutes. And then sometimes I might have a guest where they're just not very conversational, or it's hard to get words, it's hard to get stories and whatnot out of them. And next thing I know, it's like pulling teeth in a 14, 15-minute interview where, yeah, that would have been perfect if my podcast was 15 minutes, but I like to do 45-minute episodes. So again, it's just doing that two-way street between the host, the guest, setting those expectations up so that the guest knows, okay, when I go onto the podcast, here's what to expect. And then for the host, for the guest and the host knows what to expect from the guest, and the guest knows what to expect from the host. So it's just really having that good relationship between the two of you, just so that way you can go out there and make a good episode together.
Knowing the actual length of the podcast episode is pretty important. I remember being a guest way back when, and I was invited onto a show I didn't realize was only 5 minutes long. And they asked me who I was, or something very vague, and I started my spiel. I started the story, and I got through the what was it? The first 5 minutes was what a failure I was in college, and then the guy was like, "Well, okay, we're done." Wait, there's the whole turnaround story. Now we're done. I don't think that one made it on to air. But you also mentioned punctuality, and I don't know if it's the military aspect, of my life, but a lot of podcast hosts, they batch their interviews like me. I spend one day a week interviewing guests. The rest of my week, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a father like yourself. I'm also a runner like you, right? We have busy lives. So one thing I was saying I like to repeat quite a bit, especially somebody who violates the punctuality rules. Punctuality is your respect for other people's time. Um, Besides that, you're not making a great impression before being a guest on somebody else's show. So that's definitely important. Actually, in all aspects of life. Uh, Speaking of you and being a runner, you have a couple shows, including one called the Hybrid Athlete Dad. And congratulations, by the way, on was it your first marathon?
First marathon, yep, completed. It'll be it would be 3 weeks this Sunday since I've done it.
That's fantastic. And by the way, you described almost perfectly everybody hitting that wall. What everybody experiences right around miles 17 to 20. Everything's going great, and then the wheels just start falling off. So, uh, well done.
Yeah, thank you.
And I don't know how many times I've experienced that I've been running since about 2014, and yeah, about 10 years now. And I've run a few marathons, ultra marathons, and yeah, you're keeping track of time, keeping track of your fuel, water, all of that. And then at some point, your mind just starts to wander.
Hmm.
And or you're feeling great, so you don't think you'd have to follow that plan. Anyways, I just wanted to let you know that that last episode, you're describing your first marathon, was spot on. You know, but also uh, being an entrepreneur, being a podcast guest, uh, is it placement coordinator? What do you call
Yeah, I think you call it like booking agent.
it? Agent, and wearing these different hats. I'm curious, where are you? Oh, you're also a real estate investor, correct?
Correct.
Was it the chicken or the egg becoming this uh, podcast professional or real estate?
So it was because of the podcast company, just working with all these real estate investors, kind of got the bug where, you're talking to them all day, you're working with them on a monthly basis. I was like, this real estate thing's pretty cool. You see how well their companies are doing. And that kind of got me more the interest into investing, was just working through the company.
So, what do you invest in?
Yep. So I'm what's called a passive investor. So I'm not an active investor. And the key difference between those two is I'm not going out and like managing the tenants of the property. So you could picture like an apartment complex. I'm not managing any of that. I'm more what you would call an LP. So you have your LP and your GP. Your GP is the person that goes out, they find the deal, they manage the deal. I'm an LP where I invest 25 or 50K into the deal and I get a very small portion of it. And the way that it looks like is basically that'll buy you shares of that apartment building. Similar, I say similar to the stock market, but it's not, you can't liquidate your shares. It's not like you're selling off a stock. It's very hard to liquidate it. But basically, with that said, so I invested in one multifamily deal, one triple net lease deal, which is basically buildings of like Dollar General, of I think it's Family Dollar, and then a vet office. So like Dollar General, they don't buy their buildings. We basically not me, but the person that I invested with, they bought the building and then they leased it out to Dollar General. So that's what that looked like. And then I invested in a self storage development deal. Basically, as it sounds, there is a self storage facility. There's a ton of land on the facility, so they're building more self storage units. And then also a mortgage note fund. And what mortgage notes are mortgages that people own. In essence, not to get too technical, let's say you can't qualify for a conventional mortgage and maybe you don't have good credit or whatnot, then this company will help you go out there and help you get a mortgage. And because you don't have good credit, they might charge you maybe, I don't know what the interest rate is now. Say the interest rate is 6%, they're going to charge you 8 or 9% interest. Where obviously they have to charge you a little bit more because your credit's not as good. But then you basically work with that company to pay off the mortgage at just a little bit higher rate. So it works out on both ends because you can't qualify for a conventional mortgage just given everything that's going on, but they're still able to get you in the house, just and they make their money on that higher percentage points on that. So it's been good investing in these real estate investments. I've reinvested in the mortgage note fund and then the triple net lease offering as well, because I was looking to invest in another deal this year. And this was back in July. And I just didn't feel comfortable with everything that's going on in the real estate market. There's been a lot of folks in the multifamily space that have lost a ton of money. And the reasoning behind that is a lot of people talk about leverage when it comes to real estate. So what that means is most people were buying properties with 80% leverage. So similar, if you're buying a house, you put 20% down and then you finance 80% of it, just to be simple. But a lot of these investors had variable interest rates, and because of that, they had a variable interest rate, say at 3%, and then interest rates climbed so much to say 7%, so that now they're refinancing their property now at a 7% interest rate versus a 3% interest rate. Yeah, that might impact me or you if it's just our primary home. But when you're talking $1 million apartment complexes, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 million, 4% change on the interest rate, that's just going to crush them. And then because of that, a lot of these multifamily investors have either had to sell their property at a total loss or have had foreclosures, maybe getting a minimal percentage back. So because of that, I just didn't feel 100% comfortable finding a new operator to invest in. And an operator would be the GP. That's the person that I would be putting my money with. So I was like, well, making good money, or making, I wouldn't say fantastic money, but making money on this triple net lease offering and these mortgage notes. And they've been paying consistent monthly distributions for like the last 20 months. So, and they've been good. So I was like, okay, let me just reinvest in them. I know them. I like the company. Why not keep doing with it? So it's been nice investing in it. And I think it's perfect for me because I don't want to manage tenants. That's not something I want to do. I got enough going on, like you mentioned, running the company, having a family, trying to do all the running activity as well, like training for a marathon. There's a lot of time that goes into it. The last thing I want to do is a tenant to call me up at 1 a.m, tell me the toilet's broken. I'd rather just, take a little bit less, make a little bit less money, but have someone else manage those problems for me.
After these messages, we'll be right back. I'd like to thank the sponsor of this episode, Extraordinary Delights, EODFudge.com. Extraordinary Delights is a disabled veteran, family-owned small business making handcrafted fudge and other sweet treats for the chocolate-loving patriots just like you. Go to EODFudge.com and check out some of our delicious flavors like triple threat chocolate with or without walnuts, mint dark chocolate, strawberry and creamy white chocolate, or my personal favorite, American Pick-Me-Up, an all-American version of tiramisu. While you're there, go to the apparel store and check out our awesome t-shirts, polos, and the baddest tactical apron on the market. You see me wear on the TikTok show, Aaron Hale's Cook Without Looking. So, right now, go over to EODFudge.com and pick out some fudge, other sweet treats for that patriot in your life with a sweet tooth. That's EODFudge.com. EODFudge.com. And now, back to the show. Just for clarification, for those who don't know, triple net being the difference there being if you're a landlord and it's a single family home, the tenant is generally responsible for almost nothing when it comes to maintenance, insurance, and a triple net is different because it's just the opposite. The tenant does the insurance, maintenance, taxes, all of that, and the landlord, for the most part, doesn't. Is that about correct?
Yep, that's correct. So really, the biggest risk that you run with that, 'cause it sounds really good. The tenant pays the insurance, the taxes, the maintenance, and obviously the mortgage as well. They pay you that check every month, and then obviously you make your spread depending on what you paid for the mortgage versus what the tenant pays you. Really, the biggest risk there is just, I'm sure you've seen commercial buildings where the basically the people leave, and then you have a hard time finding the tenant, and that's probably the biggest challenge and the biggest risk that you'd find with the triple net lease is that, let's say you do have a Dollar General in it, and they decide, hey, after 2026, when our lease is up, we're no longer going to be renting out your space. We're going to be moving down the street to a space that's cheaper with more square footage, and you can't match that price. Not to say that would happen, but that's like the biggest risk that you run with it. But it's nice. I mean, you have what do you consider your corporate grade A tenants? So that's going to be like your Family Dollar, your AutoZone, your pharmacies like CVS and Walgreens, where like, I mean, if they can't pay rent, then there's something really wrong with their business. I mean, these are probably say multi-billion-dollar companies where they're more likely to pay you on time than if you're renting out a single family rental where maybe someone starts to fall behind. I don't think that would probably ever happen within the triple net lease space. Again, it might be different depending on, are you just renting out to like a local business or this multinational corporation. So there's definitely some risks involved, but doing your due diligence, and like you mentioned, that's why I really like that asset class, is just because they cover the insurance, the maintenance, and the taxes. But you just do run that risk of, if the tenant does move out, how easy is going to be able to, find another tenant to move in.
Well, besides finding potential partners and investment opportunities by being a podcast guest, what are some more of the benefits? What are some of the reasons somebody would want to be a guest on a podcast?
Yeah, I would say couple of different things. One is just the personal branding aspect of it, where you go on a podcast and people sort of look at yourself as like an authority, where it's like, oh, this person was featured on a podcast, he must know what he's talking about. Not to say that that's always to be true that everyone knows what they're talking about on a podcast, but that's a portion of it, is just building up that brand awareness. People be like, oh, I've heard this guy in this podcast. Let me go check out his website, or let me go check out his social media. So there's that personal branding aspect of it. There's the aspect of being able to drive more leads for your company or business. So in my industry, to give you an example, why our clients work with us is that they're more often than not looking to raise capital. And when they're looking to raise capital, what that basically means is they're looking to find people to invest in their deals. So we place them out there on these podcasts where they can hopefully explain their story, hopefully explain what they do, with the goal of people learning more about them and the goal of people investing with them. Sometimes it might be a coach selling their coaching service. Maybe it's another B2B business, or maybe not so much B2C. That's a little bit more difficult. Like, we worked with a guy a long time ago where he was more personal branding, and his aspect of it was he was selling this hot sauce on Amazon. I mean, he was doing crazy numbers, like tens of millions of dollars a year in revenue. And now, we don't work with him anymore, but that's going to be a hard product to sell if you're going out there on a podcast and you're selling this $8 bottle of hot sauce, where that's going to be more of your personal branding play. So it's personal branding. It goes back to the driving more leads for your company. And I say leads because it can be very hard to make a new customer or a sale right away from going on a podcast. I find that podcasts are a great sort of top of funnel strategy where people get to learn more about you. But the odds of someone listening to a podcast and being like, I'm ready to invest with this company right here, right now, is not too likely. So it's going to be more, okay, they visit our website now. Now, do we have a landing page built out, or do we have a lead magnet where it could be an ebook, or could they follow me on social media? And just those touch points where they get to learn about you over time. And then again, that's why I say it's more of a lead generation business. And then it's up to the rest of your company to really handle it. From there, you have the SEO aspect of it. A lot of people like, where you get backlinks, where a lot of times you'll go on an interview and you'll get a link back to your site once the interview goes live, and this will be in the form of what you would consider show notes. So it's basically a recap of your episode. And long story short, the more backlinks that you get, the better Google's going to look at your website. The better Google looks at your website, the higher that you're going to rank. And obviously, the higher that you rank on Google, you're going to get more clicks to your website. So you could imagine if you're on the top of the first page when someone searches something on Google versus being buried on the fourth page, obviously you're going to get more traffic there as well. You have the social media aspect of it. I find that people like to take their interviews that they do, and you could take a 30, 45-minute hour interview and create anywhere from 5 to 10 social media clips from it there as well, which has been very nice. And then probably the last aspect of it that really comes to mind is just the networking play, where Aaron, you and I get to spend, say, 45 minutes to an hour today talking, and we get to learn about each other's businesses, what we do. And I find there's just that networking aspect that comes into play. I mean, being a host, being a guest, probably 90% of the people I talk to, nothing ever comes out of it. But you do get that 10%, okay, maybe they become a client of mine, or maybe I invest in the real estate deal based on the conversation that we have. So there is that networking play that comes into play as well. And I know that there's probably more reasons why, the benefits of being a guest, but those are really the ones that come top of mind when I think about it.
I hadn't even thought of that. As far as I know, as a host, the search engine optimization, SEO, trying to get your name out there, your podcast out there as much as possible, and cutting it up into clips or different segments, or creating a almost like a blog article out of a podcast, show notes, that kind of thing. But as a guest, you almost get that without the uh, all the expenses of creating your own show. You get almost the same benefit from being on somebody else's show. And you can do the same thing. You get your name, you know, on into the interwebs that many times, and on YouTube and Google, however many times you can chop it up. Wow, that's an incredible thought. Well, thanks for the idea. But the other thing we mentioned earlier about the audience, that avatar, when creating your brand and getting that marketing out, should you be looking for specific genres, specific shows? How specific do they need to be, or is it better to cast a wide net as a guest?
So I say it's typically better to cast a wide net because you never know which podcast the audience is going to resonate with. Sometimes it might be the first podcast you go on, might be the fifth podcast that you go on. But in our industry, and I always just go back to the real estate just from working on it, where if you have a multifamily real estate investor, it probably doesn't make sense for them to go out there and go on podcasts that are targeting people that say fix and flip houses. It's just two totally different audiences. Most people aren't fix and flipping a multifamily apartment complex. It's more of maybe more of a value add strategy, and they're going to flip it. I guess you can consider flipping it, but it's going to be 3 or 5 years down the road, where someone that's actively fixing flipping house, that's going to be say 6 months or a 12-month process. So from that standpoint, or if you're a real estate investor, it doesn't really make sense to go on real estate agent shows there as well. So you definitely want to hone in a little bit about who you talked about or who you talk to. But I know for me, like, I can talk to the general real estate audience. If we try to get very specific and down into a niche, I want to have a little bit harder of a time. Like if someone's honing in on me talking about triple net lease deals and like all the financials, where I have a baseline, I understand what to look for in a deal. But if I'm trying to hold down a 30-minute conversation, that's not going to be for me. But I can talk general real estate, how I look at all these deals, how I vet these sponsors. So I want to make sure I'm going on a general real estate show. I know that I can go on a general business show, and I can even go down specific when it comes down to the marketing aspect of it as well, where I can go down podcasting and go into building a company, of hiring employees and different things like that. So for me, I know, okay, like these are the type of podcasts I can go on. So you just got to think back to yourself, okay, like who do I want to talk to? And is it going to be very specific? Like to give you an example, we have a client right now where they are, I think, like a local bank, and they only work in the state of Washington. So they're confined to only wanting to interview people, or they only want to get booked on podcasts of the audiences in the state of Washington. We might have a client where maybe they're a real estate investor and they only raise money from engineers, or they only raise money from doctors. Okay, like that's the very specific audience. If we put you on a podcast that's talking to one of these other audiences out there, it doesn't make a ton of sense. So you just have to go back to, okay, like who's my target audience? Who am I looking to speak to, and really go from there. But again, you don't want to cast it like so wide, reaching out to every single show out there, but just starting off with, okay, like this is my audience. Let me start to see what type of podcasts are out there.
Yeah, that reminds me of it was a real estate syndication fundraiser who markets specifically to dentists. Uh, so, where do you go to find the dentists, right? And then you would be looking for other podcasts that dentists would be listening to.
Yep.
Okay. I've been on a wide variety of genres when it comes to podcasts, from business and entrepreneurship, real estate, mindset, speaking, all of those. But it becomes more about strategy then. Is that right?
Yep, exactly. It comes out to like, and again, it comes about to just checking out the podcast before you go on it, and knowing, okay, like who is the typical audience. And again, whether you're going on, you're talking about your business, or you're going on and you're talking about your mindset, and it's just checking out previous episodes, it's checking out the show. Because if I'm going on, and again, it just goes back to me, if I'm going on a business show, I'm probably not going to be talking too much about real estate. I'm going to be honing in on podcasting. If I'm on a real estate show, I'm going to be talking more about real estate and not going too much into, they don't necessarily care about how to grow a company with employees and different things like that. That's just not the type of audience. So again, you just got to do your due diligence on the show, but you can definitely speak to a ton of different audiences. I know even like for our clients, they'll want to switch up their pitch depending on who they're looking to talk to, whether they're looking to go on general business, whether they're looking to go on a specific business type shows. Like we had one guy who worked with like dentists, doctors, and lawyers. Let's say those are three different audiences, and he knew exceptionally well how to speak to all three audiences. But if we try to cover speaking to doctors in a lawyer's podcast pitch per se, it's going to sound a little off. So then you may want to make it specific, and obviously that's going to take more work to do that. But in the long run, your chance of getting booked as a guest is going to be a little bit higher than if you're just sending out a blanket pitch to every single host that's out there, regardless of whether you can talk to them or whether you can't, talk to them at the end of the day.
We definitely want to bring that value to the host and the host audience, right? That specific show. So you got to have a versatile story, or at least be able to tailor it to the lessons learned that will the audience will appreciate. I was just thinking, I've even been on cooking shows because I've got a chocolate company. Just thinking, I make fudge. Here's a great recipe. And by the way, you can invest in my real estate projects. But I can make it work. Uh, what else? What other components to this? Being a great host, being a great guest, and having a lesson to teach, a story. What other aspects of this free marketing are important for people to know?
I'd say the biggest aspect of it is just being consistent, whether you're being a guest or whether you're being a host. So if you're taking it from the guest perspective, not that you have to do an interview every single day. I think that'd be a bit too much, but maybe you're being consistently on a podcast, say 2 to 4 times per month, where you continue to get to go through, you get to practice your story. I know for me, if I go on a podcast, let's say today, and then I go on a podcast 3 months from now, I'm going to be a little sloppy. My story is not going to be as polished just because I haven't talked on a podcast in 3 months. So you just want to make sure that you're consistent with it. And then same sort of thing if you're being a podcast host, and it's much more about the consistency. It's like, okay, if I'm going to be a host, how often am I going to produce my episodes? Am I going to have a daily show? Am I going to have a weekly show, monthly show, whatever that may be? Okay, most shows are going to be weekly. Okay, when is my episodes going to go live? They're going to go live Mondays at 12 a.m. So that way I know they start off the week. Those are going to be my episodes. And you want to make sure that you're very consistent with that, because if you all of a sudden produce on a Monday and then next week it's on a Thursday and then it's on a Friday and then back on a Monday, the audience is going to have a hard time adapting to that and listening to your show, where they'd rather it be consistent, knowing like, okay, this is when this podcast interview is going to be coming out. And with that said, I think there's some sort of statistic out there where it's like 90% of podcasts don't get past their 10th episode. And I think it just goes back to that consistency aspect of it, where people start to think, okay, I want to start a podcast. And that sounds great, but not realizing, one, how much work that goes into it. And then two, they interview a guest and then they try to put out the episode the following week, where you want to have that backfill of episodes. Maybe you have, I don't know, say 5 to 10 interviews at any given time already ready to go 5 to 10 weeks out. So that way you don't run into that issue where I'm trying to do my podcast and now I run out of time and I don't have anyone to interview. And then you go a few weeks without interviewing anyone. And the next thing you know, it's been months and no one's listening to your podcast anymore.
Excellent tips. So be punctual, be consistent, have a good story, something to bring to the table. And I maybe add, don't just answer yes or no questions. Don't ask them, and don't leave the host hanging for a story, right? Hanging for an answer. But any other pointers?
I think we've pretty much covered them all. I think those are really the big ones. I mean, Honestly, the biggest one is just going out there and doing it. I mean, it can be super intimidating being a guest for the first time or host, depending on which side of the spectrum, or maybe you want to be both a guest and a host. It's going to feel uncomfortable in the beginning, and it probably takes about, I'd say, 10 or so episodes for you to start to get your footing, for you to start to feel comfortable. So just to understand that first time you ever do an interview as a guest, it's probably going to sound terrible. First interview that you conduct as a host, same thing. Probably not going to sound too great, but just the more consistency that you do with it, the more episodes that you do, it's just going to be better overall. And that's the biggest piece of advice I give to anyone within the podcasting space, because hosting a podcast or being a guest, it can take months or weeks or even months for you to really start to see results, especially if you're starting your own podcast. It could be a year, it could be 2 years before you really start for people to check out your podcast and to take off. And then same thing with being a guest. It could be weeks, it could be months for you to start to see those leads coming in from the shows. So it's going to be a long process, and just having those expectations from the beginning, where you're not going out there and running like a Facebook ad or a Google ad, where I could throw in $1,000 into a Google ad over a week, and I can see, okay, here's how many people clicked on the ad, here's how many people signed up on my website. Where podcasting, it's going to be a little bit more drawn out. It's going to take a little bit longer of a time period. So I think just knowing that going in, and knowing that, okay, it's going to take time for me to build this podcast up, and I shouldn't expect overnight success with it. Where, yeah, if you already have that social media following, maybe, but for most of us out there starting our show or being a guest, it's going to take some time to really see those good results.
It's good to remember. So I think that's a good place to lead into our final segment, which is the countdown to impact. This is 3 books, 2 quotes, and 1 person who have all made an impact in your life.
So I would say for the books, probably the 3 books, will probably be Steve Jobs or Walter Isaacson. That was just been one of my phenomenal reads, just going into Steve Jobs' biography, going into his background. It's a pretty lengthy read. That's probably why I remember it. It was like 600 or 700 pages, but was well worth the read. Another book I would say is I was going to say Think and Grow Rich, but it's called Outwitting the Devil by the same author, Napoleon Hill. And that's just a good book that goes more into your mindset. And you could think about in a reference, almost like having that devil on your shoulder. And that's just pulling you away from your goals, from your dreams, trying to keep you within your comfort zone. So I find that book is very good. And I think not too many people know about it as compared to that Think and Grow Rich book, where it's kind of a staple. People always recommend that book within the personal finance, even in the business space. And then I'd say the third book would probably be The Wealthy Gardener. And that's more of a real estate book. But long story short, what I like about the book is it's basically goes into parables, but it's a chiropractor teaching his son how he built up his real estate portfolio to, it's either 100,000 or 200,000 a year in income, but he built it up over 20 years. So it wasn't something that happened overnight. And I forget how many units he built it up to, but I find with a lot of real estate stories, people say, oh, I grew my business from 0 to 1,000 units and within 1 year. But this is someone that actually did it on their own money. They didn't take any additional investor money. So I really like that aspect of it. And then when it comes to the quotes, and there's a long one, I forget all of what it says. I used to have it hanging up in my room, but it's one by Steve Jobs. In essence, it's all about thinking differently. And it was a speech that he gave at, I believe it was at Stanford. It was a commencement or graduation speech. And he just talks all about thinking differently. And if you think about Apple, like how they changed the world and what he had done and he had gone through, and you can learn a lot about this reading his book as well. But the speech was just all about just thinking differently and, okay, like, how can I, just because someone is saying that I can't do it, then I'm going to think differently and, go out there and do whatever I can on my own. I'm probably butchering it a lot here, and I haven't looked at the quote in a little while. I used to have it right in front of me, and then I don't know where it is. It might be sitting in my basement somewhere, but there's that quote. And then the other quote, I believe it's by Napoleon Hill, or actually I might go with one with Jim Rohn, where he says, I think it's something along the lines of education will make you a living, self-education will make you a fortune. And what he means by that is I went through college and yeah, I can go out and get a job and that'll probably cover the bills. But the self-education of me studying real estate, of studying entrepreneurship, that's what's going to allow me to make a fortune. So again, I probably butchered that quote a little bit, but in essence, that's what it sounds like. And then the one person I would say that's really been able to help me and look up to has probably just been my father. Just having those conversations with him all the time. He ran his own business for quite a while. He was always into the personal development space back with like Jim Rohn and Dennis Waitley and some of your old school people even before Tony Robbins came onto the scene. So he was always into that. He was in sales for quite a while, and then he ended up starting his own company. And long story short, he ended up becoming a teacher at the end of his career. Just wanted to do something totally outside his comfort zone, totally different, just to do something different, honestly, at the end of the day. So I think the inspiration of talking to him pretty much on a daily basis, always asking, okay, like what's going on with the company, like anything you need help solving, anything that you want to run by me. And it's just nice having someone to lean on, like, okay, like running a business is definitely the hardest thing that I've ever done, but it's nice having someone in my corner that I can go to and bring questions to and get feedback from, almost like a mentor.
I'll tell you what, I'm a huge fan of Jim Rohn, and he's got so many quotable quotes. But I also appreciate the fact that uh, you mentioned a different book from Napoleon Hill other than Think and Grow Rich, which is a great book, but I also think it eclipses some of his other incredible works. So we'll make sure to put all of those examples in the show notes and try to find a link for that Steve Jobs speech, because I think I know which one you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But which was an excellent speech. So, final question before we wrap up is: what are you most excited about? What is inspiring you now, and how do you plan to make an? I guess there are two questions. How do you plan on making an impact in this world?
So I would say really what gets me excited right now is honestly just our daughter, my wife and I have. So we have a soon to be 17-month-old daughter. She's, I guess you could consider 16 and a half months. And just seeing her growth and development, really in the last year or so, where I'm obviously quite a bit, but even in like the last 4 or 5 months, she went from crawling to walking. Now she's repeating our words. She's seeing our actions. And I know you mentioned like the hybrid athlete dad, and that's for me is just trying to make that inspiration for her to show like, yeah, I'm running this business, but I'm also spending time with you. But now I'm training for these events. And that was really the big inspiration, was trying to show her like these are the hard events that I can do. So for me, that was like picking up running, where I went from basically running a 5K back in the end of May, early June, to then running the first half marathon in August, and then 6 weeks later running a full marathon, and then the goal of next year doing a half Ironman, to then doing a full Ironman at some point, maybe in the fall of next year, and just being that inspiration for her. Whether, because I feel as though like she doesn't, not that she can't see, but like when I'm running a company, like she doesn't know like, okay, I got new clients or I'm growing the business, but she can go to the marathon, she can see me running, she can cheer me on. I'll take her to like my triathlon swim practice. It's not so much swim practice, but join a triathlon club. And obviously it's not open right now in New York. It's pretty freezing out. But during the summer months, I can go and I can swim around a lake in my wetsuit, and she can see me come out of the water, come out and say hi to her, go back in and do another lap. And yeah, maybe she won't remember that, but I'm trying to hopefully provide the inspiration to her, and just take all in that I can to help her out and help her grow and provide as much wisdom that I can for her. And that's really been the biggest thing. And really, that's just so much changed in the last, obviously, since she's been born, been running a company. I mean, just the mindset of, okay, I'm going to work 12-hour days. I'm going to do everything I can. I'm going to be running my business all the time. Like, okay, I want to take a step back. I want to make sure that I'm spending more time with my family, that I'm not doing my business while my daughter's home, where, right now she's at daycare, and making sure like, okay, if I give myself 40 hours a week to work, I want to make sure that I get everything accomplished in it. And if I can't, then I need to go out and hire someone. So it's just been a change in perspectives, and really just trying to be that inspiration for her as she grows up and, starts to understand, more things that are going on.
That's admirable, and actually pretty incredible that you're able to make that kind of progress, especially while being a dad to a very young child. And I was just thinking back to, was it all baby's first steps to don't run into the street.
Yep.
But that's fantastic. Congratulations on your progress on being a dad, and I wish you all the best there. If if our listeners can want to get in contact with you, how can they?
Yeah, most certainly. They can go to our website, podcastingyou.com. That's podcastingyou.com. Or they can go directly on my LinkedIn and find my name. It's going to be under my name, Trevor Oldham.
Fantastic. And again, that'll go into the show notes. Well, Trevor, I really enjoyed this conversation, and wish you all the best.
Thank you. I appreciate it.